Our prayer. Gracious God, as we turn to Matthew's Gospel, we remember that you shared our humanity from birth to death and beyond death so that we might share your eternity. Receive our grateful praise today. We acknowledge that we need your blessing. We pray that you will open our hearts and minds to see you, to hear you, to know you, and to love you, that we may glimpse more of your glory in our lives, and we offer you our praise. We ask for your blessing on the various members of our church family and extended family as we've been mentioning them by name, and pray for your help and guidance for each one of them. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Now, we're turning to Matthew 26. As you can imagine, we're on the last lap of Matthew's Gospel. And we're turning to Matthew 26, and we're picking it up from verse 57, which begins with these words: "Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest." Now, one thing to say is that when you study something as important as the crucifixion of Jesus, to get the full picture, you have to look at all of the Gospels. Because, to give you an example, there are what we call the 7 cries of the cross. There are 7 occasions when Jesus speaks from the cross. And you don't find them all in one gospel. And so you have to go from one gospel to another to pick up all 7 of them. Each gospel does not give you the various trials that Jesus went through. For instance, Matthew doesn't tell you about Jesus going on trial before the Sanhedrin, then he goes to Pilate. But Matthew leaves out the bit in between, which is where Pilate sent him to Herod, King Herod, for him to deal with him. Because Pilate was trying to get rid of Jesus. He was a hot potato. If he could pass him off to someone else saying, well, this man's under Herod's jurisdiction, it's not my job to judge him, he was going to wash his hands of it and get rid of it. So Matthew doesn't include that, and that's just one example. You have to look at all the Gospels to get really all the details of the crucifixion. Now, although it says here in verse 57, they arrested him and took him to Caiaphas, we know from other Gospels that they took him to the house of Annas first. Annas had been the high priest before Caiaphas, and he happens to be Caiaphas's father-in-law. And the Romans had removed Annas from his post as high priest. Normally you served for life. It was you died in office once you were chosen as the high priest of the Jews. You served until you died, like the popes used to do. And then a new high priest was picked. Well, the Romans changed all that because they wanted high priests who were pro-Roman and who were pliable and would do what the Romans wanted. So first Jesus is taken to Annas' house, and then we pick it up here in verse 57. Let's look at it. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest, and he entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Now, obviously, we know that when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples fled. We're told that specifically. As they took Jesus away, they ran away, and they disappeared into the darkness of the city. But Peter sort of righted himself. He didn't run too far. He regained his courage. He regained his strength, and he decided, well, I'm going to follow. I'm going to see what happens to Jesus. I'm going to be close by if there's anything that I can do to help Jesus. And so they take him there. Now, verse 59 The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Now, I mentioned to you last time that there were several laws which the Jews had broken. You could not have the Sanhedrin have a meeting at night. That was illegal. You had to give all the members, the 70 strong members of the Sanhedrin, which was like the Senate of the Jewish nation, you had to give them notice that you were going to have a meeting, you were going to have a trial. It had to be during the day. The second thing that was illegal is you had to, even if you heard all the evidence, say on Tuesday, you could not bring in a verdict on Tuesday. You had to wait till Wednesday. The law was that you had to sleep on it, you had to consider, you had to allow time for mercy or compassion or new insight to come to your mind, and then you would come back, reassemble, and decide what the verdict was on that particular person. So they break these several laws, and they meet together because they want rid of Jesus. They want him. They've got him in their power now, and they've got these people willing to put up false evidence. Now, it's clear that their false evidence doesn't gel. One is saying one thing, one is saying another, one's arguing against the other, and they're realizing, well, this doesn't work. We can't go to the Romans with this because the case will be thrown out. Now, the only reason, remember that the only reason they need Pilate is because they no longer had the authority, the power to sentence anyone to death. That power had been taken away from the Sanhedrin after the Romans invaded under Pompey. So, finally, let's go further down. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus replied, "Yes, it is as you say. But I say to all of you in the future, you will see the Son of Man." Again, that's Jesus' favorite description of himself. "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. And they spat on his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who it was that hit you." So here is the first real trial of Jesus. And this idea that, well, he said he would destroy the temple of God. He didn't. Jesus said, if you destroy this temple, and I'm sure Jesus did this, or some gesture that indicated he was talking about the temple of his body. If you destroy this temple, it will be raised again in 3 days. Not the temple, meaning the temple in Jerusalem, but this temple, the physical body. He was thinking of his resurrection. Now, Jesus stands and remains silent. Lie upon lie, perjury upon perjury, false charges against, on top of false charges are made against him. Jesus makes no reply. He makes no defense. And we believe that this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah, where in Isaiah 53:7 it says, "He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." Here's Jesus fulfilling another Old Testament prophecy as to what will happen. we will look a little bit, if we have the time today, we will look at 3 important Psalms. And Psalm 22 is the Psalm of the cross, because it has a lot of specific detail about the cross and about what Jesus endured, what he went through. Remember, this is written 1,000 years before anyone dreamt of crucifixion. There was no form of execution called crucifixion way back at that time. It was a relatively new, horrible form of killing people. And so this was by way of a show trial. And also what you've got to understand is the Sanhedrin are interested in proving that Jesus is blaspheming, but they have to switch ground. They have to change the charge when they go forward to Pilate. Because if they go to Pilate and say, this man is a blasphemer, Pilate will say, so what? This is not a religious court. You have your own religious court. I'm not interested in whether he's a heretic. I'm not interested in whether he's claiming to be this, that, or the other in the Jewish life and religion. I'm interested in civil unrest. I'm interested in keeping the peace. And unless you come to me with charges that relate to that, I don't want to hear it. So they knew that simply accusing him of blasphemy was not going to get them anywhere with Pilate. And so Caiaphas wants to hear Jesus say he is the Messiah. He wants him, and he puts him on his oath. Now, look at verse 65. It just shows you the cultural differences. Notice what it says. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard this blasphemy. What do you think? And of course they agree, well, he's worthy of death. He's blaspheming, making out to be the Messiah, making out to be the Son of God, and so on. You know, Easter, this idea of tearing your clothes, nobody in Western culture would do that. We would express our outrage, we would express our irritation, our anger in words. We're not a demonstrative people. And if you're from Britain, you're even less demonstrative than Americans. You may know the story of the ship that arrives at a desert island and finds 2 British men who are castaways. Their ship sank. They were the only 2 survivors. They got to a desert island, and they lived the rest of their life until this boat came and rescued them. And one of the people on the boat says to one of the Englishmen, well, he said, thank goodness you weren't here on your desert island alone like Robinson Crusoe. You had one another for company and to talk to and so on. And the Englishman said, oh, my dear sir, he said, we were never introduced. So that's the kind of thing that you might expect from someone from Britain. But, you know, in Western culture, we don't go in for these extravagant gestures. If you've ever seen either a Palestinian funeral or that region funeral, I mean, the widow has to be restrained from jumping into the grave. Have you seen that? You know, she's absolutely, I mean, the grief is over the top, you know, and she's almost going to leap on top of the casket and just bury me now with my husband and all the rest of it. But we don't do that. It's the difference between Eastern culture and Western culture. The thing that you'll hear in the Bible a lot is for people throwing dust on their head. We don't do that. Tearing your clothes. Here we would say, tearing my clothes. Are you kidding? This is a Ralph Lauren suit. You got to be nuts. You know, we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't dream of doing it. But in that Eastern culture, there is this dramatic acting out how you feel inside, the tearing of the clothes, the dust, the whole idea of just expressing outrage and anger and awful feelings and so on. Deep feelings. So it's a cultural difference. Now, as I say, the Roman authorities are not going to be interested in what the Sanhedrin have decided that Jesus is guilty of. It's not a civil matter, it's not a political matter, it's not a military matter, and so on. Look at verses 67 and 68. You see them spitting in the face of Jesus, literally. And then they begin their mocking. They're trying everything to humiliate Jesus, to insult Jesus. Matthew doesn't mention that they blindfolded him and then slapped him and said, okay, prophesy, if you're the Christ, prophesy which one of us slapped you just there, and so on. So it's all part of this humiliation, this gestures of insults, and so on. Now, all of this is going on the inside for Jesus, the humiliation, the despicable way which they deal with him. Now we switch from what's happening on the inside of Caiaphas' home. We switch to what's happening outside in the courtyard, and the spotlight falls on Peter. Let's look at verse 69. Peter was sitting out in the courtyard as a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. That's the people also sitting around the fire with him. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, that you could have passed that off. Verse 71. Then he went out to the gateway where another girl, he thought, well, I'm going to get out of the way here because this girl clearly recognizes me. So he goes to another part where the gateway is. Another girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. She doesn't say it directly to Peter, but she says it to the people sitting with Peter. This guy here was with this Jesus of Nazareth. And he denied it again. And it gets a little hotter here because he denies it with an oath, with a curse, with foul language. I don't know the man. So it goes a little further. After a while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them, for your accent gives you away. And he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore, I don't know the man. And immediately a rooster crowed. And then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now, here is Peter in fear and panic. He's sort of persuaded himself he's got to go back. He's got to take his courage in hand and so on. He's got to go back and see what's happening to Jesus. He owes this to Jesus. And he goes there, and then the worst of all things happen. People begin to say, oh, you're one of these fellas. And of course, what he fears is that he's going to be arrested next. Somebody's going to say to someone in authority, this guy is one of his disciples. Oh, well, we better have you along as well. And taking him off. Now, Peter is afraid. He's fearful. He doesn't want to lose his life. Fear makes people do strange things. Fear makes people panic. And he's deeply concerned. Now, in Luke's gospel, Luke tells us that at that moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. At the moment that the cock crows. You think how poignant that is? Bad enough that Peter remembers, but he looks over and there's Jesus in chains with his back to Peter, and at that moment he turns around and he looks at Peter. And what happens is that Peter rushes out into the night and weeps bitterly. Peter completely loses it, and the worst part is remembering that he's just done exactly what Jesus told him to do, told him he would do. And of course, he had denied it. He had been arrogant about it. He had been really in hot denial. You'd love to be able to see. You'd love to have some artist paint the face on Jesus as he looks. I believe it's a look of, it's not a look of "I told you so." Would you agree? On the face of Jesus. I don't think Jesus looked at him and went, "See?" You know, I mean, human nature being what it is, has anyone ever sort of said to you, "I told you this was going to happen"? Yeah. Anyone's husband or wife has told them that. When things go pear-shaped, you suddenly find that someone is willing to say, "Well, now, I told you this would end in tears. I told you this would end up like this. I told you this was a bad idea." I don't think Jesus looked at him in that way. I think he looked at him with compassion. And sadness, yes. And realization, "Oh, Peter, you know, I tried to warn you. I tried to put you on your guard. I tried to make you think about this before you get to this point. But, you know, I told you this is what was going to happen." The look on Peter's face must have been horrendous. He knew everything that he loved, everything that he knew was like sand just running through his fingers. And he runs out and weeps. The tears, the hot tears, are coming down Peter's face, and so on. Now, remember that now we move on to Judas. Now, when you think about it, there's a connection between Peter and Judas. We have no idea where Judas spent the night. He obviously couldn't go back to the upper room. Peter or some of the disciples would surely kill him because they had watched him betray Jesus. They'd watched him be a traitor. Let's pick it up in verse 1, chapter 27. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people came to the decision to put Jesus to death. They bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate the governor. Then Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned. He was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." Now, what do these religious leaders say to him? They say, "Well, what's that to us? What do we care?" You know, all his usefulness was gone. They had no compassion. They had no sympathy. They had no interest. He had served his purpose. He had been paid. Well, you do what you like with the money, is what they say. And Judas threw the money into the temple, just threw it down on the ground. You can hear it jangling across the marble floor. And the temple officials just shaking their heads and saying, "Oh, what does it matter? We have our man. We have him under our control." So Judas threw the money into the temple and went away and hanged himself. Now, both of them had betrayed Jesus, and but I think Judas was sorrowful, but he wasn't repentant. He was bitterly sorry about what had happened, and as I say, he must have spent an agonizing night alone. And here he goes back. Judas is no longer needed. He served his purpose. He's been paid his blood money. Now, Peter wept bitterly. Those are the tears of repentance. Judas was remorseful. There's a huge difference between being remorseful and being repentant. he wished he could turn back the clock. He wished he had not done it. He wished he could do things differently. And he tried to salve his conscience. The silver coins which he had so desired were burning in his hands. And hating himself. And he hates them. Think of it, you have 2 disciples out of the 12. One went out and wept bitterly. That's Peter. And one went out and hanged himself. That's Judas. They had the same advantages. They had the same privileges. They had the same opportunities. Different outcome. Because they behaved in a different way. That's true in so many instances. You get people in families are very, very different. Brothers can be very, very different. My best friend was Bob Gordon, and his brother, he had a twin brother, David. They couldn't have been more different. Physically, emotionally, in every possible way, they were different. But they were twins. There was no similarity in any way. But they behaved differently. Here are 2 disciples. Both had the same, both heard Jesus, both heard his parables, both saw Jesus heal people, perform miracles. Very different, but different people inside. And so Jesus is here going to be taken to Pilate. Now, the latter part of that story, it says from verse 6, the chief priests picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And they took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used it to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. So they bought this parcel of ground. It was going to be separate from all other burial grounds because it was for foreigners. Somebody came to Jerusalem and they were from another country, they were a Gentile or whatever, they would be buried there. But they wouldn't be buried amongst the Jews. Now, all 4 Gospels contribute to the scene of Jesus on trial before Pilate. Now, let me paint the background. Pilate was governor between AD 26 to AD 37. And he certainly did not want to be in Jerusalem. In the Roman Empire, this was one of the probably the most unpopular postings ever. Nobody wanted to go to Jerusalem. It was a hot potato which no Roman governor wanted to deal with. There was always trouble. No matter what you did was wrong. The Jews were troublesome, difficult, unpopular people. There are always, if you think about it just in normal terms, there are, every country in the world has embassies or consulates in other countries. We certainly do, the French do, the British do, and so on. And you go and serve. When we were in Florida, one of our dear friends, Peg and Bill, they had a son-in-law who worked in the State Department in Washington, D.C. And at one point in his service during our time in Florida, Richard was sent to Khartoum in the Sudan. Now that was like being sent to Jerusalem. It was very unpopular, it was very difficult, it was a very dangerous place. Embassy staff had been murdered in Khartoum. It was a war zone situation amongst people who hated Americans. It was a very tough posting. But here is Pilate in this place, and he's trying to strike the balance between being firm and fair, and not to deal with the Jews too harshly. Now, Pilate had a bad beginning. He had messed up in the past, and we understand that he was on his last legs here. He was on his last warning. Because in the past, the Jews had sent a delegation to Rome to make their complaints to Caesar. It would have been Tiberius at this point. And they went to Tiberius Caesar. They traveled all the way to Rome, and they presented a catalog of what Pilate had done wrong. And they were people of influence and so on. So Tiberius really was not a great fan of Pilate. And all it needed was one more complaint, one more delegation, one more angry group going to Rome to complain. He was in an almost impossible situation, and he knew it. Now, when Jesus was presented to Pilate, as I say, they have to change the charge. They can't say he's a blasphemer. They have to say he's a rabble-rouser. He's a pretender to the throne of Israel. He claims to be a king. He's a threat to Caesar. He's a problem for peace. He's promoting rebellion and revolt and so on. And we don't want any trouble with you, but this man is going to create trouble. He's going to whip the crowd up into a frenzy and so on. And so he goes. And that's how they pitch it. Now, pick it up at verse 11, chapter 27, verse 11. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I'm always intrigued as to how Pilate asked that. You know, he's looking at a man who has been spat on, has been abused, he's going to have bruises on his face, he's in chains and so on. He's not anyone's idea of a king at this point. He's been roughly treated, and what does Pilate ask it sarcastically? You know, is the subtext, "Are you a king of the Jews? Are you the king of the Jews then? Well, you don't look much like any king I've ever seen." Is that what Pilate is saying? Or is he genuinely curious? He's saying, are you, they charge you with this, are you the king of the Jews? You've got to wonder which way he says it. But Jesus says, "Yes, it is as you say." Now, some translations are a little bit different. Some suggest that what Jesus is saying when he says, "It is as you say," some scholars suggest that what he's saying is, well, you decide. You take a look at me, Pilate, and you decide, what do you think? In Mark and Luke, they say very much the same. John gives us a bit more. John tells us a little bit more of what Jesus says to Peter. Now, as I say, if you look at Matthew, you look at Mark, and you look at Luke, Jesus is simply saying, well, you decide for yourself, Pilate. You make up your own mind. Am I the king of the Jews? You have to decide. But here's what John says. This is what John records. He says to Pilate, "Yes, I am the king of the Jews. I am a king," I think is technically what he says. But he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." I'm a king, but not in the way you're thinking of. I'm a king and not in the way that Caesar is a king. I don't have legions behind me. I don't have armies. I don't have armed troops. I don't have all of those things. I'm not the kind of king you're thinking of. And it's interesting that Jesus expands this for Pilate because he senses that Pilate is a blank page. Pilate doesn't know. Now, Pilate has spies, and Pilate had heard of Jesus. Here's this new prophet from Nazareth, and they say he can do miracles, and the stories, of course, would be told to Pilate. But here they are saying, well, he's a king. He's claiming to be a king of the Jews, and, we really need to take action. We really need to be rid of this man. And Jesus says, well, you decide. It is as you say. Verse 12. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders and gave no answer, again like the Sanhedrin, Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now, it's probably at this point where it is revealed that it dawns on Pilate that he could possibly get rid of this hot potato because he lives in Nazareth, that's his home base, and Herod Antipas is in charge of that region of the country. So he sends him off to Herod. And Jesus won't even speak to Herod. He won't say a word to him, won't answer any questions, won't address him, nothing. And so he's sent quickly back. Now, Pilate has an instinct for these things. He has a nose for what is fair and what is not fair. So he thinks to himself, well, here's the second way that I can be relieved of the responsibility. Because he has a tension. He has an anxiety about it all. He has concerns about it all. So he falls back on the old custom. Pick it up at verse 15. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who was called Christ? For he knew that it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to them. Now here's where it gets worse. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him this message. Don't have anything to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. So if he had anxiety before, if he had concerns before, if he had hesitation before, this makes it worse. His wife says, look, don't sentence this man. Don't deal with this man. You're dealing with an innocent man. And Pilate instinctively knew that. He had that sense. He hadn't been a governor for a long time, but he'd been a governor long enough to see lots and lots of prisoners. Don't have anything to do with him. Verse 20, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? Pilate answered. And they all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. Now let's stop at this point. As I say, Luke tells us that the first lifeline that Pilate thinks about is, he's not in my jurisdiction. I can send him to Herod and let Herod deal with it. Let him take the flak for it. I can escape from this dilemma. And so here's another journey for Jesus. Remember, they put him in chains. They take him from the Garden of Gethsemane to Annas' house. Then they take him from Annas' house to Caiaphas' house. Then they take him in chains to the governor's palace, to the official residence. Then they take him from there to Herod's palace in Jerusalem. Then they bring him back from Herod's palace, back again, and he ends up back with Pilate. And so Pilate was not at all fooled by the motives of the Jews. He knew that they were trumped up charges, and he saw very clearly that Jesus was an innocent man. He saw that it was a religious problem. He saw this was a squabble, but he couldn't. He tried to push it so far. But the biggest concern always, especially at Passover, with the city filled to people to bursting, was if there's a riot, as many troops as I have in the city, there's not enough of them to quell the mob. There will be a riot, there'll be destruction, there'll be death. I will lose soldiers, they will lose people, and again, complaints will go back to Rome. It's a difficult situation. And so his second, then, he thinks, well, who are they going to pick to be released? Are they going to pick this holy man, this man who went around the countryside preaching and teaching and healing the sick? Surely they're going to pick him. Or are they going to pick a notorious robber and murderer called Barabbas? Are they going to ask for him to be released, or are they going to go for Jesus, the good man, the holy man, the man who has done so much good for the people? Speaking about the perversity of the mob. Now, they'd been whipped up to this, and some of them had been paid to cry out for Barabbas, a notorious robber. But, you know, mobs are fickle. Wasn't it Benjamin Franklin who said a mob has dozens of heads and not a brain between them? And that was his quote. Now, Jesus had no defense attorney. He had no one to represent him. And here throughout the trial, the judge, Pilate, was doing his very best for Jesus. But he could see that he was fighting a losing battle. And the mob will not be satisfied. And Pilate uses this dramatic gesture of washing his hands to say, well, you know, on your own heads be it. You must take responsibility. I've washed my hands of the whole thing. Now, let's look at what they say in response to that. Verse 25. All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Think about that. Just let the depth of what the Jews are saying. Oh yeah, we'll take the responsibility. His blood will be on our hands and on our children's hands and our children's children's hands. And you look down the panorama of history and you see the end of their nation, the end of their homeland, the end of their sacrificial system in the temple, the end of the destruction of Jerusalem. They no longer had a city to go home to. They no longer had a country to call their own. From AD 70, they became pilgrims and strangers in every country in the world. Why? Right here. Because they say, we will accept the responsibility of killing this Jesus of Nazareth. His blood will be on our hands. What a price. What a price the Jews paid for this. You know, you hear someone make some statement and you say, do you realize what you're saying? Have you really thought this through? It's the worst rash statement in the world. They have rejected God's Messiah. They have dismissed God's plans for his people. It's truly mind-blowing. when you look at how all the dominoes fall from this time forward. Now, we'll have to stop at that point. Has anyone got any questions or any comments or anything they want to share? Yes, the dominoes are, in some ways, are still falling with the Jews, and they have paid a terrible price for this decision made to be responsible for the Son of God's, or for the Son of God's death. Okay, all right, everybody, thank you so much. And good luck for those of you who are going to the planning meeting. Plan well, which Women's Fellowship always does.